So I helped organise a workshop um, to build these boards, which is this is called the crackle box. It's kind of a musical instrument. Maybe I can just get it to make so it makes noise, um, and it's kind of a classic electronic instrument. But it's quite a simple design based around a single op amp. But anyway, it's quite an interesting experience kind of doing the workshop. And I kind of wanted just to get some of my thoughts on like what I would do differently next time down. So I hadn't really thought of this workshop as like a workshop for first time soldering people. It wasn't really designed as a learning to solder workshop. That's kind of what it turned to be, as it's mostly like kids and young people who came to the workshop, and obviously they'd never soldered before, and it was kind of interesting teaching them. So I don't think this was an ideal board for that, but they did really well, and most of them got it working. There were a couple who had trouble, and I've been going through and looking at like what went wrong with those boards to help me understand what we could do better next time. And I had a few thoughts. So basically, one thing is I think I'd probably make like any pads I would make just as big as possible. So the pads on, for example, on the speaker connector and on the 9 volt, the battery connector here, I would probably space them out a lot more, and I'd make the pads a lot bigger. Um, some of them just had trouble kind of getting into the pad, and I think just having the pads a bit bigger would probably help. I did have like one board had actual kind of mechanical damage around the around the pad, so they'd actually pulled off a trace. So that was why it wasn't working. Um, and in some ways, I think they needed closer supervision, maybe, because there were like 9 kids trying to do this at once, and there's only a couple of us like looking after them and kind of trying to hand them along. And I think like probably for that first solder joint, you probably want to supervise them, but anyway, I think it's tough. So I think maybe if I do it again, I might have a little test board with one sample joint on, and then watch them to do it, like doing another joint, and then after they've done that joint, say, okay, you're kind of okay to go ahead and kind of start soldering. So yeah, bigger pads, and also thicker traces, because they have a tendency, to apply mechanical force and can break the traces. So you can see the power trace here is much thicker. I would probably try and make all of the traces that thick. I'd also make the text bigger. So I tried to make it so that you didn't really need a build guide. So I put all of the component values on the board, and I thought it was fairly clear which component they were referring to. But I think I'd make the text even bigger. I think I'd make it as big as like the U2 here. I'd make that 100 nanofarad marking that big, and I'd probably remove like where it says C4. I don't think you need the designators on a board of this size. Because they're just picking out the component values. I'd also add plus and minus markings on the batteries, so I'd spread out the battery terminals and clearly mark things like plus and minus. I think that would be good. I had also someone accidentally misplaced op amp. I think one of the things is they're so eager, like some people are so eager that they would just shoot off. Once they'd place the components, they'd start soldering, and it's like, it would have been good if they'd stopped. And I checked it over. So I probably would add that explicitly. I'd say, once you've put all the components in, stop, and I'll check it over, and then and move on to soldering. And so I also, with these transistors, I had the two of these were swapped around. With solder, I use 0.6 millimeter solder generally for through hole stuff. So I think the stuff we had was kind of a bit thicker. I think for kids they have a tendency, or inexperienced people in general have a tendency to apply too much solder, and with thicker solder it's very easy for them to do that. So I would probably use like a medium gauge, like this kind of thickness solder. Um, I don't know. I want to say use leaded solder too. I don't know if that's allowed. But I think I would say leaded solder flows better. I'd probably bring some flux as well. Um, I'd bring more stuff for rework. So I think I might even, because like someone when they'd messed up the op amp, uh, I said, oh well, we're gonna have to get it out, and we couldn't get it out, and I said, well, you snip off the legs. And they'd snapped off the legs so that they were really short, so I had to pull them out with tweezers. So I think even like rework stuff, like a rework microscope, even might be handy. A good oscilloscope for debugging is handy too, because like when I've built this board, I'd be reasonably confident of most of the joints, and I think it would, generally work. But being able to debug like the failures in the board and look around with a scope would be quite useful. Yeah, and I think the other thing I do to help myself out is easier components. This op amp, while it looks cool, and that's partly why I wanted one of these CAN op amps here, I think it's a little bit difficult to get into the socket. So I think it's probably better not to use a CAN op amp. So yeah, that's basically it, I think. So I made a short kind of list. Bigger pads, thicker traces, bigger text, bigger than the standard text marking, no designators, plus and minus markings clearly marked on the batteries, good solder, good flux. I also think temperature controlled soldering irons are a good idea, because I think it's easy to screw up soldering anyway without a temperature controlled soldering iron. And I think these cheap kind of 30 quid or probably $30 soldering irons that you get on eBay are fine. But yeah, temperature controlled, yeah, and easy components. Those would be the main things. And if you can manage it, I think bringing a scope along is good, because I think it's cool for them to see that as well, so they see the scope output of their circuit and help them debug that as well. People will need a lot of supervision, so I would also suggest small groups. Okay.